Jumping over to college football with a segment that we're calling Whose Season is Over. We're entering week 4, and some teams with big postseason hopes are already standing on thin ice. Taylor and I, along with Jim Avila, provide plenty of college football betting picks each and every week in our show Power 5 Picks. So make sure to check that out on the channel or by clicking that little info button that should be on your screen now. Rick, which team or teams jump out as either being done when it comes to postseason potential or could be on the verge of it this weekend?
It has to be Notre Dame. Heading down to Georgia. First of all, I think Georgia's a better team. But second of all, Notre Dame doesn't play in a Power 5 conference. So they have to basically win all their games to be a legitimate playoff contender like they were last year. If they lose to what would probably be one of the 4 playoff teams or maybe one of the top 6 candidates for the 4 spots, it's going to hurt them more than just about anybody. Like Michigan, if Michigan loses, I think they're right behind Notre Dame. Their postseason chances are done. Even if they win out in Big Ten, losing this early to Wisconsin, barely beating Army, not looking like a powerhouse team that people expected them to look like, their season will be done too. You know, you could even make a case for Wisconsin if they lose their post. Like anybody who's playing one of these top 25 matchups, to get a Final Four spot, you can't lose, especially this early in the season. Like if you're going to lose, it has to be right at the end, like a conference game or the last game of the season where it's against a great team, and you might still have that slight chance like Georgia has done over the last couple of years and sneaks on in there. But at the top of my list, it's Notre Dame. If they lose, their season done, and then right behind them would be Michigan.
I think Texas is done if they lose. They're playing Oklahoma State at home. They already have a loss under the belt. I don't think you can lose 2 games and still make the playoff. Plus, they have Oklahoma in a couple weeks. So, you know, Oklahoma State's the kind of team that can pull these kinds of upsets every year, even on the road. So if Texas loses, I think they're toast. I think Michigan is another obvious candidate. Like Rick was saying, you can't barely beat Army and then lose, even on the road to Wisconsin, which is a good opponent, a tough game. But, you know, that win against Army was really a loss, and I think the committee will view it that way. So if they lose a game to Wisconsin this weekend, I think they really have an uphill climb. I think Washington's probably already out. We were talking before the season about how the Pac-12 is like you have to either go undefeated or have a really good one-loss. They don't have a really good one-loss, even though it was a weird weather kind of scenario. So even if they do wind up, beating Oregon or something later in the season, it's hard to imagine them really overcoming that. Oregon has a better loss. I think they have a slim chance if they run the table since they lost to Auburn. But, you know, all these teams that we were talking about before the season being very likely playoff contenders are already kind of on the ropes, and it's only September. So I think these teams are kind of on the watch list right now.
I want to just mention one quick thing because I do disagree with Rick on one. I totally agree Notre Dame, if they lose to Georgia, they're not going to have enough on their schedule. I forget if they play Clemson or not, but even they're viewed, even though they are like ACC adjacent, they're not viewed as a Power 5 team if they don't go 12-0. So I agree with you on that. Michigan, obvious one. That game against Army was terrible. Where I do disagree is that if you're going to take a loss, you need it to be in one of the first 3 weeks of the season. You've got to win, unless you're an SEC team that gets the special treatment at the end, where you could lose to Alabama, or if you're Auburn, you could lose to Alabama in the last week of the season, not play in the conference championship game, and still be viewed as one of the top 4 teams in the country. That's the only exception. If you're in the other Power 4 conferences, you're not going to get that benefit of the doubt. You've got to get a loss out of the way early, or you have to run the table. If you lose in October, November, you're done.
I think they're all done. Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, the only chance someone has at a one loss would be an SEC team. The rest of them have no chance.
So to that point, the 2 teams that I'm going to bring up are the 2 SEC schools that play each other this week, Texas A&M and Auburn. Whichever team loses this game this week is going to be in a position where they're going to lose a tiebreaker to the other. And even if, let's say Auburn beats A&M on the road, great road win, puts them way up there. If they then lose to Bama, let's say Bama loses to LSU, like there's no way for Texas A&M to get a spot at that point. If A&M wins, even though it could be a 2-point game or a 3-point game, and Auburn could have gone into one of the tougher facilities to play in as a road team and lost, I still don't think that they're going to be able to get back in because they're going to have to play Bama. And even if they were to beat Bama, A&M owns the tiebreaker to get into the conference championship game. So it's one of those things where the loser of that game, I think that may not be, they may still be somewhere near the top 10, top 15 in the rankings, and they might still be able to climb back to the top 7, but they have no shot at it because they're going to put themselves behind the other and Alabama, and you just can't do that if you're in the SEC West. So those are going to be the 2 teams I'm going to throw into the mix there. Now, I brought this team up last week, so let's talk UCF one more time. The Knights crushed Stanford in week 3, jumping out to a 21-0 lead in the first 7 minutes. They led 38-7 at halftime en route to a 45-27 win over the Cardinal. The win moved UCF up just 2 spots in the AP rankings to number 15. This week, their final game against a Power 5 team this season as they visit Pitt, a team that took Penn State down to the wire just 1 week ago. Rick, there are 13 undefeated teams ahead of UCF as we sit here, plus 1 loss Texas. Is there any hope for the Knights to contend for the college football playoff at all this year? Or is this just another situation where the Knights could dominate, run the table 13-0, and be left way on the outside as they have been the last 2 seasons?
Yeah, that's exactly what's going to happen. There's no way they're going to get up there. The only shot they have at climbing up to even the top, let's just say the top 6 or 7, is if you have all those teams ahead of them lose more than 1 game. Even with 1 loss, if that 1 loss comes in conference play to another ranked team, the loser is not going to fall down. Like even if Michigan lost to Wisconsin this week, they're not going to fall below UCF unless they lose a second time. And say Notre Dame can lose this week. They'll still be ahead. Like there's all these teams that'll still be ahead of UCF. UCF is going to win, go undefeated for like 10 straight years, and still not make the playoffs based on the way the system is. What we're seeing here is what's going to end up changing the system again. Like we've had issues in the past with teams and championship games to create this new playoff system we've had over the last couple of years. What we're seeing with UCF, it's going to be another example that's going to lead to another change because 4 teams is just not enough when you don't have the same parity where the Power 5 is weighed heavier than teams that can just run the table year after year after year. We're not talking like this is the first year they've come out of nowhere and they can go undefeated. This will be their 3rd straight year where they have a chance of going undefeated. Unfortunately, they're going to be on the outside looking in because I think even a 1-loss Georgia would still get in over them like's happened in the past. I think Big 12 conference winner, Pac-12 conference winner, all those conference winners, even if they have 1 loss, will still be ahead of UCF. And I don't think UCF did enough against Stanford. They let them score too many points. If they were to keep it a 30 or 40-point blowout, they would have more hype around it. But they let them come back too much. And this weekend against Pitt's a solid team. UCF has to go up there and win by at least 3 touchdowns. Like they have to blow everybody out to continue for people to say, well, what about UCF? What about UCF? If they're just winning by a touchdown or a couple points, it's like, well, what about UCF? Like, why does it matter?
Yeah, it should take multiple losses from these teams that actually play good teams. You know, UCF, if your best win is Stanford or Pitt, that's not overly impressive. Stanford is not a good team, as we've seen. Previous years don't really matter, as we've seen with the committee. You know, if you go undefeated for 3 years, I don't think they really care about that. UCF's schedule has nobody on it. I think these teams that actually play other good teams should be ahead of them. If you're playing UConn and Cincinnati and East Carolina, that's just not impressive. So, they tried to schedule Stanford. They maybe thought Stanford would be good. They're not. It's unfortunate, but it's the reality. It's just the way the system is set up. I do think this could, like Rick was saying, wind up causing the field to expand down the line. But as it stands now, I don't really see them having enough, qualifications to actually get in. Even if they do go undefeated, I think these 1-loss teams obviously will get in over them. It's not unfeasible to think we could see 3 SEC teams in the playoffs if things go a certain way. So, yeah, well, it's just the way it is. So I don't think UCF deserves it, so I don't think they're getting it.
Okay, number one, if the SEC gets 3 teams in, the playoff doesn't come back next year, because that's the basically the nail in the coffin for something. When you had that Bama LSU championship game, they basically spent the next few months trying to figure out what to do to prevent something that was allowed the 3rd best team in a conference to be ranked number 2 in the nation and get into the national championship game. But I do agree, it's an unfortunate part of this system, because when UCF schedules these teams, they scheduled Power 5 schools. Stanford has some national credibility, except for this year, which is unfortunate for them. Pitt can be a solid team. They were actually pretty decent a year ago. And it's not unfathomable that in that ACC, if they could win 8 or 9 games. And the truth of the matter is that playing 2 what are normally very good Power 5 teams is basically an SEC East schedule. It's a little bit of a light version. It's an SEC East schedule if your West counterpart is Arkansas and Ole Miss for the year or something like that. But it's not like, if you have a team, like I said, it's an unfortunate part of this system, because there is absolutely no way for a school like UCF, a school like Boise State, who was UCF before UCF was UCF. There's no way for a school like that to ever do anything, because they could win every game 49-0, and everyone would go, yeah, but they didn't play anybody. They'd be like, yeah, but they haven't given up a point all year. They've outscored everyone by 50 points. They've scored 600 points, and they've given up 0. Everyone's still going, yeah, but Georgia had a really good loss to Alabama in the conference championship game, and they were only lost by 4 to Florida. And it's like, yeah, they lost twice, but this is a team and a program that has won a major bowl game, that has lost 1 game in the last 2.5 years. They won a major bowl game over SEC. I believe it was an SEC team, or a Power 5 at the very least, that first year, where they went 14-0 and were named national champions by one outlet that UCF has declared. And they went 13-0 a year ago before losing in not blowout fashion, but it wasn't exactly a tight game. But, they didn't lose horribly in their bowl game a year ago to a major program. So, again, it's just one of those things. It's a terrible part of this system where you've got 128 teams or something like that are all technically competing for a national championship, and only 50 are allowed to play for it. Because even when you go Power 5, the only shot that they realistically have is if the SEC champion Alabama goes 12-1 and no one else has less than 2 losses. The Pac-12 champion loses twice, and the Big 12 champion loses twice, and the Big 10 champion loses once. But even then, they'd probably be left out. But if you can get an Ohio State and Alabama, and there is not another team that looks obvious, because the rest of the ACC is trash, and the rest of the Big 10 is garbage, and the Pac-12 is entirely awful, and the Big 12 champion went 10-2 during the regular season, then you probably do get Alabama and either Georgia, LSU, one of those teams. And then if you don't have UCF, then you've got to scrap the whole system at that point, if you're going to let multiple multi-loss teams in over an undefeated team. But I digress. It's just a terrible part of what continues to be a terrible system. Hey, maybe California, New York, and South Carolina will actually spark something with the legislation that's already passed in California and is being voted on in New York and South Carolina to allow players to be paid. Maybe that will end up sparking something where the NCAA has to overhaul. Who knows? I can hope anyway. I hope you enjoyed that segment from the Odds On Favorites podcast. If you did, there's plenty more where that came from. Click on the link on your screen now to be taken to the complete podcast from this week, or check out the channel to find the other individual segments. And make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Odds On Favorites YouTube channel for plenty more sports and sports betting picks, tips, and how-to guides.